It's easy to feel empathy for Tiny Tim, but what about people who have more serious mistakes or people who aren't innocent? Can we still feel empathy for them?
Yeah.
And if we could do that with real people as well, we're practicing with stories, but if we can do that with real people, then we're starting to, right, make reading meaningful to us.
I've noticed in some of the books I've been reading lately, they're kind of on the heavier end of the spectrum as far as like kind of uh, deep topics on painful subjects or just difficult topics that are either politically charged or just uh, anything about religion and ethics and that kind of a thing. And I've noticed that it's actually had a huge effect on me and my opinions, my perspective, and I think that's an important thing for all of us to try to do, is to kind of get outside of ourselves and find new ways of thinking, find ways to empathize with people, because it helps me create connections with people, but it also helps me understand ways that I can be a better person, right? And so I was hoping that maybe you could kind of help us out with kind of delving into this idea of how reading even does this. Like, how does reading a book broaden our perspective and develop empathy?
I'd be happy to address that. Yeah, it's something that I think is, for me, the most important thing about books, and the reason why we should still support writers, why we should still kind of preserve previously untold stories. So one of the things that I looked at in my master's degree was Victorian literature. So in 19th century England, there was this burgeoning sense of what they called fellow feeling, but what we modernly would term empathy, right? So it was all about feeling what your fellows feel. And I love the term fellow feeling anyway, because it just makes it a little bit more understandable, maybe, of what empathy really means. So the Victorians, maybe you look at like a popular Victorian novel, like A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Oh, I love that book. But so it's all about Scrooge developing fellow feeling, looking at his own past and some of the hardships that he experienced, and then feeling bad for himself.
Mm.
And then he also meets other people who experience hardships, sometimes the same hardships, sometimes different hardships. And he realizes, oh, we all have these hard things in our lives. And that, he awakens literally on Christmas Day to this sense of fellow feeling. And it makes him different. It makes him a better person, kind of like what you were saying, because he now can use his funds, his talents, his gifts to uplift other people, to kind of like acting out charity. Um, and there were other Victorian novelists who thought, well, that's great, Charles Dickens. Like, Tiny Tim does make us feel empathy because he's so sweet. He's innocent, he's pure, he's kind and generous, and he has this, obvious flaw of his sickness. It's easy to feel empathy for Tiny Tim, but what about people who have more serious mistakes or people who aren't innocent? Can we still feel empathy for them? That was a really interesting question, kind of in the latter half of the 19th century for writers. One of my favorites is George Eliot. This was a woman writing under a man's name. She was kind of a right proper scandal for Victorian England. She was living with a man who she was not married to. She was not religious. She had grown up religious and then left her faith. And that was not something that you do in, at that time period in that place. And so she was properly scandalous. And yet she wrote some really beautiful books about religious people, in which we saw their flaws, but we also saw kind of the big picture of the person. So it wasn't just about their mistakes. They also had these good qualities, and they had hard things happen to them too. And there was a much better sense of fellow feeling because you have flawed people who were not like the author. They were different, you know? So she wasn't trying to uphold them as perfect paragons or whatever. These were just, if you will, real people who had made serious mistakes. And we still developed fellow feeling for them, or developed empathy. And that's hard to do nowadays, especially. I think we're losing in public culture, we're losing a lot of that empathy and fellow feeling. And so it's interesting to look back at how books have addressed that for hundreds of years at this point, you know, that they're trying to help us see the big picture about the people around us. And that has really helped me to step outside my own experience and inside someone else's experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Books do that better than movies or TV shows, I think, because in writing, you can often see the person's inner monologue. What are they really thinking? What are their reasons behind this? In nonfiction, same idea, right? You get to see some of their reasonings. And what I think is interesting about nonfiction is that it's not necessarily nonfiction because it's true, but it is that person's understanding of what is true. And so you get to see other people's understandings, which are often different than ours. And it just, so reading anything can really help you see from other points of view, and ideally develop empathy that can turn into charitable actions.
Yeah, I totally have felt that too, and it's kind of it's an interesting experience that can even happen. And I think when we're more intentional about building empathy, it also helps me to like make sure I'm listening for the purpose of that fellow feeling, like getting some kind of understanding for that person rather than just enjoying the story. Because I mean, I think there's a benefit in enjoying the story as well, but I think there's also like, it seems like it's been more meaningful to me to like intentionally look for ways to develop empathy for this character, this person that I'm reading about.
Absolutely. And I think if you lose yourself in the story, you develop empathy without noticing it.
Oh yeah.
So I read for in two different ways. First, I read to enjoy the story. I'm reading almost as if I'm just kind of believing everything that comes my way. I read in that kind of frame of mind. And then afterwards, then I start to analyze. I start to think critically, not critically meaning trying to find mistakes, but critically thinking, okay, what was this author's point? What was their, did they have an agenda? Which, most of them do, whether it was purpose or kind of subconscious. But who were they trying to write to? Why did I feel the way I did when I was reading it? And that helps me to kind of realize and reflect on the fact that I am developing empathy, and that I did, in a way, experience that person's story. And then I can, once I've realized that, I can then act on it, I think, more purposely, more intentionally, like you were saying.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I like that idea of kind of playing with both parts, because it is fun to just kind of lose yourself, and then it's also fun again to go back and like figure out the whys behind what your experiences were. So I like that idea.
Yeah, I had that experience a couple days ago. I read a book. I read a lot of books during the 2020 pandemic. And but this was the first book that I got so lost in that I forgot there was a pandemic. And that I realized, like, I got up and took my walk outside after I finished reading the book. And I had my mask on, and I didn't even think, because it was part of my routine. And halfway through my walk, I was like, oh yeah, I have the mask on, because not because it's cold, but because there's a pandemic. I just totally got lost in this story. And it was so delightful. But then afterwards, that story dealt with PTSD, dealt with some really deep, dark things. And so then I started to be able to think through, why did I get lost in that story? Why was it so meaningful to me? Did I have a similar experience? And not really. It was about a detective. It was a murder mystery, but it was a detective who had made a mistake, and it cost people their lives. And so I was like, that has never happened to me. And yet there was something about that person's feelings, the way he wanted to keep going after making mistakes. And he kind of picked himself up out of the dirt, out of the mud, and kept going. that, resonated with me. And so being able to look back on the story does give you that perspective and allow you to think, okay, this is where, I had a similarity or something in common with that story, with that character.
Yeah.
And if we could do that with real people as well, we're practicing with stories, but if we can do that with real people, then we're starting to, right, make reading meaningful to us.
Thanks for stopping by to watch this clip from an interview that I had with Tony Pilcher. If you want to see that full interview, go ahead and click over here. And if you want to check out her YouTube channel, you can also check that out over here. Thanks so much for stopping by. Your challenge this video is to go out, find a good book, and start practicing putting yourself in someone else's shoes.